let's start. How about that? Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Charles Shapiro. I'm the president of the World Affairs Council of Atlanta. I'm delighted to have you here today. Our program today is with Chargé d'Affaires at the U.S. Embassy to Venezuela, James Story, who goes by Jimmy. Jimmy's a career foreign service officer. He spoke at the World Affairs Council. I think it was like November 2017, something like that, Jimmy, when you were the consul general in Rio and you were in Atlanta on your way home to South Carolina. Appreciate that, and it's great having you back. Jimmy from Moncks Corner, South Carolina. You can Google it. It may be there.
The gateway to Charleston is what Stephen Colbert calls it.
Yeah, good. Anyhow, and if you know where Moncks Corner is, raise your hand. Jimmy's also a graduate of the University of South Carolina. And as a result, we are going to conduct this conversation in Southern English. I hope the rest of you can follow it. So Jimmy, let me start off with this. Why is the U.S. Embassy to Venezuela located in Bogota, Colombia? Can you just quickly explain why you're there and how come you're not in Caracas?
Sure, and hopefully my explanation will be clearer than the fact that you all are opening up for business this week. I'm glad. I need a haircut. I don't know about the rest of y'all, but I'm sure y'all get it in Georgia. You know, when last year in January, let's go a little bit further back, and I'll try to be quick. In May of 2018, there were largely considered fraudulent elections for president in Venezuela. And the term of the president ended on January the 5th of 2019. And in between that time and the 23rd of January, the National Assembly elected on the 5th as President Juan Guaido. And what happened on the 23rd is he assumed a vacated presidency. And the United States very quickly recognized him as the rightful leader of the country, according to the Constitution of Venezuela. 57 other countries have signed on and also recognized him as the president. But at that period of time in early 2019, first, Maduro told us to all get out. He PNG'd the entirety of the embassy. We no longer recognize Maduro, so we refused to leave. I did send most of the staff home. I stayed behind with a small team. And then over a period of time, the situation in the country just deteriorated and evolved. There were roving bands of criminals. A lot of people were being killed. There was no electricity, no water, and we could no longer have a certainty of our security. So what we did, temporarily suspended operations at the embassy. I brought the flag down on March 14th. We flew out, and subsequent to that, we were working out of Miami and Bogota and in DC, and we recognized that we
hear anything he's saying.
So here, up an embassy in exile, if you will. This is similar to what we've done in other places. For instance, we have a Libya external office in Yemen. We had the embassy for Somalia in Kenya, the one for Yemen and Saudi Arabia, so forth and so on. So we're operating from here. It happens to have as well co-located with the foreign minister for President Juan Guaido, Mr. Julio Borges. We have the opportunity to engage with Venezuelans very closely and directly here in Colombia.
Okay, I'm getting text messages from my staff saying the sound quality is not good. So if anybody has your microphone on other than Jimmy and me, please mute yourself. And hopefully that will improve. I don't know that anything can improve me, but can improve you. And okay, so you're in Bogota. So you don't go to Venezuela at all, right?
That's correct, but trust me when I tell you, Venezuela comes to me. I have on any given day, and they all come on Friday evening for the weekend, it seems. But I've had an opportunity to, obviously, President Guaido here before he went on his world engagements. We spent a couple of days together here in Bogota. Again, Julio Borges, the foreign minister's here, and any number of members of the National Assembly, and of course the diaspora community of Venezuela. They're probably close to 2 million Venezuelans in Colombia now.
We got 20,000 Venezuelans in Atlanta now. So Not quite what you have, but there's a whole bunch of them, and some of them are on this call. Okay, everybody's talking about COVID. And first of all, and I apologize, I'm being told that my sound is well.
Yeah.
The system in Venezuela has collapsed. The economy has collapsed. Can you talk a little bit about what's going on with COVID there? I mean, how are they managing that? How are they, we're having a hard enough time dealing with it in the U.S. What's going on in Venezuela?
So Venezuela took early, quick action to stop, close their airspace, which has probably blunted an initial problem of a huge, fast growth. Equally here in Colombia, for instance, I'm on day 34 of quarantine. I only leave my house to walk the dog. Can't go to the grocery store really. I have to come to work today, but even that's kind of difficult. But let me be clear on a couple of things. They were lucky up front because they didn't have a lot of international travel to and from Venezuela, and that's kept things relatively more in check than in other places where you have a lot of international travel. New York, for instance, and these kinds of locations where people are coming in and out. But when I was there, I visited some medical facilities. And well before our sanctions started in January of 2019, they were already in abysmal shape. And I can tell you about 50% of the hospitals in the country have no running water. 2/3 of the hospitals have no soap. Most of the machinery is no longer functioning. And a lot of that is because of basically corruption. The money was stolen, mismanagement, malfeasance, and what have you. You have about 20,000 medical professionals who have fled Venezuela. So they have a dearth of people capable of handling the problem inside the country. And now what the regime has done is they've also stopped all private clinics from doing testing. And they're managing all the testing through one national center. The fact of the matter is that the regime is claiming that they're the highest tested country in the region, that they've provided 25,000 tests a day. I did the math on that, and it would be a couple of hundred per minute at this one lab they had. It's not true. It is completely false. They're claiming 256 cases or so. They're using it to politicize the situation more. The fact of the matter is, it's a much bigger problem than they're letting on. 85% of the population live day to day, meaning that they don't have the luxury of being at home expecting to get food brought to them or medicine or what have you. They have to go out to get that. And we're already seeing a significant uptick in demonstrations, especially in the poor neighborhoods that you know so well, Patari, for instance, and people are rebelling against the government. And I think that that this is going to grow and be a bigger problem for them over time. I anticipate by the middle of May, they're going to have a very big problem on their hands with no ability to deal with it. And again, I want to say this one more time. This is not because of sanctions. Our sanctions give a carve out to humanitarian aid. So
if they wanted to buy stuff from the U.S., they could do so. I mean, how would they get it delivered? How would it get there?
They bought $78 million worth of corn in bulk commodities last year for the United States of America. I've asked for 15 months, the foreign minister, I was on the phone with him for an hour yesterday, attempting to organize a repatriation flight of Americans who are still in Venezuela. And I was being very generous. I was going to allow some Venezuelans to get on the flight going back for free. I still can't get there with them. But I've asked for 15 minister, give me one concrete example of a company that says, I won't sell you medicine because of sanctions. And they've never done it. Michelle Bachelet, the former president of Chile and current High Commissioner for Human Rights of the UN, has asked the exact same question this week. Give us concrete examples. And they haven't done it yet because they don't exist.
Okay, well, you've got that going on. And at the same time, you've got a complete collapse of the oil market globally. So that oil futures yesterday were actually in negative pricing, crazy as that sounds. Venezuela's number one legitimate export is oil. I mean, so they've got, you know, you cross those two on your chart. How are they managing? What's going on?
They're not. They're not. And what I'll tell you is what I tell a lot of people. They're potentially weeks away from descending into chaos completely. There's no gasoline in the country. We are not blocking gasoline from going into the country. They have the capacity to produce or refine 1.3 million barrels of petroleum per day. But again, because of malfeasance and corruption and malpractice, they're able to do about 30,000 barrels a day. And they don't have the money anymore to do any imports. The cost of producing a barrel of oil in Venezuela is relatively cheap. You know, OPEX is about $7 a barrel, or CapEx is $7. The problem now is transportation costs used to be $1 a barrel because they went up to Louisiana and Texas. Now it's got to go to Asia, so it's $11 or $12 a barrel, and they're not geared for that kind of dirty oil from Venezuela. So they pay a discount of $12 a barrel. They don't make money until they get in the mid-30s, and it's their only source of income other than illegal narcotics and the sale of gold. That's it.
Okay, so that raises the obvious question for me is how? So a year ago, more than a year ago, we recognized Juan Guaidó as interim president of Venezuela. Most European Union countries and the Lima group of nations did as well.
Yes, sir.
We've sanctions on Venezuela. We've indicted a number of high government and low, everybody in between. They've got this huge mess with a collapsed economy, hyperinflation. Now the price of oil has collapsed because of COVID. How in the world is Maduro staying on? I mean, how's he able to do that? I knew him when I was in Venezuela over a decade ago. I never would have predicted that he was somebody who'd be able to deal with all of this, deal with the internal politics.
Yeah.
That he'd still be in office as the de facto president. How do you do that?
I mean, listen, it's a criminal organization. And I've often said that Maduro has become largely the mayor of Fuerte Tiuna, where he lives, between there and Miraflores. They don't control.
Stop. You got to explain to everybody what is Fuerte Tiuna and what is Miraflores.
Miraflores is the White House, and Fuerte Tiuna is a military base and barracks in downtown Caracas. And he lives in one and works in the other and back and forth. But imagine, if you will, the President of the United States only controlled part of the District of Columbia, and the rest of it was being policed by brigands, the local sheriff is Tiger King, if I can make it about what everybody's talking about. You've got the FARC and the ELN, two illegal armed groups from Colombia that engaged in a multi-decade plus 50-plus year civil war in Colombia, operating freely within Venezuela. And Maduro and company were indicted on drug trafficking charges after a multi-year investigation by the Department of Justice. And just this week, 2 airplanes flew out of Zulia, which is near Lake Maracaibo, Venezuela, attempting to get to Guatemala. One crashed before arriving. The other one landed and was destroyed on arrival. And multiple tons of cocaine were seized in both. This is still going on right now, even as we the level of our military and Coast Guard forces in the Eastern Pacific and Caribbean to combat drug trafficking. So the guy is holding on because this is a criminal organization. It's not for politics. Most of the polling has him at about 10% approval rating. Within the PSUV, which is the party of the far left of Chavez, he does a little bit better, but they only represent maybe 20% of the total population. And within that, he's not even the most popular politician. So this is I think inertia, if I remember from Berkeley High School in Moncks Corners, the second law of thermodynamics, inertia is a powerful force. A body in motion stays in motion, one at rest stays at rest. This body is at rest. And what our policies have been, most recently on March 31st, we announced a possible framework as a point of departure to get to a negotiation that allows for a peaceful, political, constitutional, democratic transition of government. We got to get this thing moving. Because right now, everybody's in stasis. A lot of people have made a lot of money in Venezuela because they've been part of this criminal organization, masquerading as government.
I mean, it sounds like you're up against Mission Impossible.
Lost a lot of hair, Charles.
Okay. So what is the role of, or the roles of Cuba, Russia, and China in Venezuela? Are they keeping Maduro afloat?
Well, so I'll define each of them a little differently. The role of China is one of commerce. I call it a commercial relationship. They're very interested. Venezuela is sitting on a sea of oil and natural resources, coltan, diamonds, gold, the largest reserves of oil in the world, and relatively easy to get to. A little dirty, a little difficult to get out, but not that difficult, not technologically difficult. It's not like drilling for oil off the coast of Brazil or something where it's really technologically difficult. The break-even's pretty high. Break-even's pretty low in Venezuela. So China wants them as part of their Belt and Road Initiative. It's a commercial play. For the Russians, it's a geostrategic play. They love to cause us problems very cheaply in the Americas. They have commercial interest there, Rosneft, but Rosneft recently pulled out. They had some debt there, but most of that's been paid off. The Chinese still have a fairly large amount of debt with Venezuela that hasn't been paid off. But for the Russians, this is a little more about how they can leverage the Venezuela situation to cause the U.S. government difficulty in the Americas. And finally, for the Cubans, it's an existential issue. The Cubans live entirely off of the largesse of free oil that comes from Venezuela. Even in the middle of the crisis with gasoline, where there's no gasoline even in Caracas. If you have a letter, you can get gasoline, but it might take you days in a line to get it. They just shipped last week 72,000 barrels of gasoline to Cuba to keep them going. So if this were to stop, you would have a fundamental change in the organizational structure of the Cuban government because they have no way of continuing on. Margaret Thatcher said they would come up against what Margaret Thatcher so famously said. The only problem with socialism is eventually you run out of somebody else's money to spend. The Cubans are spending the Venezuelans' money.
So why did the Venezuelans put up with that? What's the advantage for Venezuela? I mean, why are they giving their oil to Cuba essentially for free?
Well, part of this was ideological, right? Fidel Castro famously said once, if I had Venezuela's resources, I would export the Cuban Revolution to every country in Latin America. They provide security directly to Maduro. Maduro is protected by Cubans. And they also keep an eye on the military forces. There was an aborted coup in 2002. I think you remember that quite well, if memory serves.
I do indeed.
That's when you started losing your hair, I believe.
Exactly. I used to be a good-looking guy until then.
And the Cubans are the ones that have created this tyrannical dictatorship that represses democracy in Venezuela. So they're the ones that really are running the shots. To give you an example of how difficult, how entrenched they are, the Cuban ambassador in Venezuela is a member of the Council of State. So imagine if the Cuban ambassador,
the Council of State of Cuba or of Venezuela?
In Venezuela. So imagine if in our up in the White House when they get the cabinet together, you had an ambassador from a foreign country sitting in the cabinet meeting. It's extraordinary, extraordinary.
Okay, so but look. I can understand that, but I also understand if you're running out of oil and your own folks don't have oil, why would you keep shipping it to Cuba? I mean, that just would seem like the logical first step to put things to straighten out if I were Maduro. I mean, if you were Maduro, the first thing you do would be to stop that.
It begs the question, who's in charge, doesn't it?
Wow. Okay, so tell me about the sanctions. Should we, you sound a little defensive saying, you know, we're not causing the problems there, that in the health system. What is the impact and why, for public relations purposes, don't we remove the sanctions to make us look good, make them look bad?
So the vast majority of the sanctions are against individuals. There are some sectoral sanctions, of course, and then in August of last year, we've kind of sanctioned the government writ large. But they have these carve-outs for food, medicine, and humanitarian supplies. Their system exists to allow them to be able to buy what they need to buy. What they want is they want us to unfreeze bank accounts that they have access to. And what we don't want is for them to further steal money from the Venezuelan people that'll be necessary to rebuild the country one day. Almost all that's money. I mean, I have so many examples of all the money that's gone missing. And I might have sounded a little defensive, and I'll get personal here. Right when I was going to Venezuela, my wife was diagnosed with breast cancer. Thank God she's okay, but she was able to get treatment in the States, and she had radiation therapy and everything, had surgery, everything great. So she was a little delayed coming to Venezuela. While she was having her treatments, I went into a hospital in Los Andes, which is down in Merida, down the University Hospital, one of the best hospitals in the country. And I saw brand new radiotherapy machines for breast cancer patients that were still partially in the box, had been there for 5 or 6 years, and were not functional because they lacked a technician to put it together, and they lacked money for a few of the parts that they didn't have. And then I met a woman who was dying of breast cancer because they didn't have those parts. And all of that was I made that visit in, I think, August or September of 2018, well before any of our sanctions went into effect. And it was clear to me, and then I went to many other facilities, and I saw the horrid conditions. I saw the fact that young children were dying in very large numbers. And there's no data on this because there's total censorship of the media. And for that reason, I just started a couple weeks ago, but every Thursday I now do a Facebook Live inside with Venezuelans, and I take all questions. I answer the questions from the Chavistas who are yelling at me. I talk to everybody. There's no access to information in the country. And if you really knew what was going on, it would turn your hair white, as it's done with me. Very difficult situation. So if I'm defensive, it's because I find it to be a moral issue.
Okay. Let me here's some, we're starting the questions now. Here's a question. Thank you, Fernanda. What do the Venezuelan, first of all, is there a way to judge? Are there polls in Venezuela still? How do you conduct a poll, number one? But number two, what do the Venezuelan people think of U.S. support for Guaido and, for lack of a better word, the opposition?
So there's a group called Data Analysis in the country, still doing some polling. There's some other small firms. We have various mechanisms by which we do polling as well. And we continue to be, the United States has a long history in Venezuela. We have cultural affinity. A lot of people are dual nationals. I mean, you know this better than anybody. And we're still very much loved by people. And when it's kind of funny to see that Vladimir Pagino Lopez, the head of the military, his sister and family live in Florida and they have 4 or 5 businesses. He just came out in a report the other day. I mean, the thing that hurts them the most is when we take away their visa. They love to go to Miami and New York. Guaido remains the most popular politician in the country. And if we got to a transitional government that he very much supports, has been vocal about, an emergency government, his popularity would double overnight. He's the most popular politician in the country by far. And the U.S. remains very popular in Venezuela.
One of my members, retired U.S. Army colonel, Gene Hanratty asks if the combination of low oil prices and coronavirus is just going to remove the last vestiges of legitimacy of the Maduro government and force them to either negotiate or just hightail it out of the country.
I missed the second part. Low gas prices and what?
And coronavirus.
Or coronavirus.
Yes.
Listen, you know, I would say that they stopped being a legitimate government some time ago. And I think the fraudulent elections of May of 18, the fact that they regularly jail, torture, and murder their citizens. The Bachelet report had over 7,500 extrajudicial killings by the secret military police the last 2 years. They're not a legitimate government. Let's be very clear. The U.S. government recognizes a legitimate government as being interim President Juan Guaido in the National Assembly. And Juan Guaido is the only person who's ever said, I'm willing to step down in order to get to a transitional government. And the problem with every negotiation heretofore has been that the issue of Maduro has never been dealt with, whether he would step down, how he would step down. I firmly believe, and not in a plain Gaussian sense, you know, but I'm an optimist. Remember, I'm from Moncks Corner, South Carolina, and I'm responsible for Venezuela policy, and I get to talk to you smart people. That means anybody can do anything. So I'm an optimist by nature. Having said that, I remain optimistic, cautiously optimistic that things are so bad in Venezuela that someone will accept what I believe to be a very fair offer on the framework for a democratic transition. People ask me, well, how do you deal with Maduro? He's indicted. Well, we can deal with Maduro. We dealt with Manuel Noriega. He was indicted as well, and he had an opportunity to go to the Dominican Republic or Spain, and we wouldn't seek extradition. What is important here is what we're laying out in this framework is an opportunity for the Venezuelans to sit down and figure this out. We're just laying out a political will that we have. We're illustrating when we would release sanctions, what sanctions would be lifted when, what we see to be the transition. This remains a Venezuelan-led process. We're just trying to get them to the table in a transparent way. Every other discussion, the Dominican Republic or Barbados or Norway, has always been non-transparent, and the issue of what to do with Maduro has never been on the table. And we've put it firmly on the table for the whole world to see at this time.
Okay. I'm not sure who this is from, but I got a question here. It says, something like 15% of the Venezuelan population has fled the country and is abroad.
Right.
Some of them living in miserable conditions. And some are actually returning to Venezuela, which is a great surprise.
You want me to explain?
Yeah, could you explain why and what's the trend? Are more people going to be returning to Venezuela?
No, there are more people leaving Venezuela than going into Venezuela every day. I'd say the following. In Bogota, for instance, and I've traveled around the region and met with the diaspora Venezuela community, and I understand fairly well what they're faced with. There are about 400,000 Venezuelans in Bogota, Colombia, half of whom live in rooms that they rent by the day. Okay. That means every day they go out enough money to pay for that day. And most of them left family behind in Venezuela, and they might have a home in Venezuela or somewhere to live. And they've been, so, you know, if you can't go out and busk for money on any given day, which is the difficulty here in Colombia. We're on day 34 of a quarantine. My wife did cut my hair, by the way, Charles. She did a pretty good job, but
it looks fabulous.
I'll tell her you said that. You know, so for some of those people, the option of returning to be with family members was positive. Is probably the only option they had. Now, the problem that they're facing upon their return is that they're facing extraordinarily squalid conditions on the border. There's not gas to get them back to their hometowns. There's not water or food or medical care where they are. And that's going to feed in to what I'm telling you is going to be an explosion of coronavirus cases inside of Venezuela in a system that's completely incapable of dealing with the fallout. They have 84 ventilators in the entire country. Think about that for a second.
This is a country of 30 million people.
30 million people are in the country. They have just a couple of hundred ICU beds. The regime claims they have 12,000 ICU beds. I just told you half the hospitals don't have running water. And Dr. Luis Castro works directly as kind of the medical commissioner, if you will, or minister of health for President Guaido. They have a very sophisticated system where they're getting daily information coming into them, 14,000 reports per day, data points. And they know exactly what's out there, which hospitals have masks, have gloves, have water, have ventilators. And the government, the regime, suppresses that information from getting out because it runs against their narrative. They're going to have a problem.
I got a question here from Trevor Williams, who's the publisher of an online publication called Global Atlanta. And he says, how do you undo the patronage network between the government and Army officers?
Yeah.
A year ago, I mean, everybody was hoping that the military was going to turn, and clearly, while some have, the vast majority have not. What's the deal?
You know, not everybody is getting rich from this patronage network, but a lot of people are. You know, in 1992, Hugo Chavez wasn't a general when he attempted to do what he did. And we don't advocate for military coups. And unfortunately, Venezuela has a long history of that. They have a very small democratic tradition in Venezuela, a very democratic transition, which was fairly negotiated. Listen, as part of our framework, democratic framework, transition framework, we laid out that our recommendation would be a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I think that Elliot Abrams, who's a special representative with whom I work closely, has stated it very well. You may not see a perfect solution to what's happening in Venezuela, and not everybody is. I mean, I'd love for this to be a couple of, you've got Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton coming in off the Llanos on horseback and rewriting a constitution and everybody following suit. It's going to be I don't see it. It's going to be a very difficult, messy process that will take some time for the Venezuelans themselves to work through. But I can tell you that the vast majority of the military, for instance, are facing the exact same difficult economic circumstances that the rest of the population are facing.
Okay. This is from Merritt Simon. A great question. Said yesterday, the Office of Foreign Asset Control at Treasury gave permission for some U.S. companies to remain and keep operating in Venezuela, maintain assets, but not to lift oil, right? Not to pump oil. Can you explain this? What in the world is that?
So Chevron has been working on a renewed license of 90 days, and they have a joint venture with PDVSA, and they've become one of the largest producers of oil inside of Venezuela because they're the only really international company in the country that does this kind of work and knows how to pump oil. They were pumping, I think, around 250,000 barrels a day. The license was up for renewal on April 22nd. It could have not been renewed, meaning that they would have gotten a license just to wind down operations, leave the country. Instead, the license that they got was one to do maintenance on their facilities. But if I read it correctly, I read it last night myself. Their license is to they can't sell and transport, produce, sell, or transport oil. Now, because of the type of oil we're dealing with here, if you don't move oil through the pipelines, because you have to think about, like in Georgia on an August day, when your foot kind of sinks into the asphalt, right? That's what this oil, and you have to mix it to move it through pipelines. And if you don't keep moving it, it turns it into a giant candle. So they're going to have to pump oil to keep their machinery moving. But I think what the license lays out is that they cannot sell that oil. And they weren't selling that oil before. Well, they were selling that oil, but not making a profit. They were putting that money back into maintenance of operations inside of Venezuela.
You got a nasty cough. You need to get taken care of.
Well, it's about 12 degrees centigrade. No, maybe Fahrenheit. I should say here in my office, it's freezing, and it's closed off without any. We're in a vault here a little bit, and it's so my apologies that I'm having a little bit of trouble with my respiratory system.
You might want to get one of those tests. Okay, here's a question from Frank. I don't have the last name. I might be Frank Blunt. What's the diplomatic relationship between Bolsonaro and Maduro, between Venezuela and Brazil? What's going on?
Almost nothing. As a matter of fact, they removed, excuse me, I think I'm better now. They recently removed the last of their diplomatic personnel from Venezuela. I imagine over the course of the next couple of weeks, there would be Guaido's ambassador to Brazil will be the ambassador who's recognized. Basically the same relationship that Colombia has with Venezuela, which is none, not even for consular issues. And frankly, our relationship with Venezuela is basically based on my relationship with the nominal foreign minister, Jorge Ariasa, with whom I'm in contact, but we don't have any other diplomatic relations at all.
Okay. Gosh, I'm getting loads of questions from people from Venezuelans who are saying, this is terrible. When's it going to end? This is terrible. When's it going to end?
Yeah, I know.
Here's one from a gentleman. Whoops, and I just lost it. It says, both my parents are doctors. This is just a comment. My parents are doctors in Venezuela. They don't have any medical supplies, no gasoline, drive to hospitals or clinics. The government is not taking or trying to attack COVID-19. They're only focused on putting doctors and journalists who report new cases in jail.
All of that is correct. And let me tell, but I will answer. I know it's a statement, but I'll answer it. I'll give you a little bit more information here. We are working with President Guaido very closely. I spoke with him last night. They have a fund that was money that was in a bank account, city bank account that's been moved to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And what we are trying to do is move that money to international government organizations such as PAHO, the World Food Program, the ICRC, International Committee of the Red Cross, in order to expand services inside of Venezuela. Now, the regime will attempt to take credit for all of this. And I really don't care, but I wish they wouldn't politicize it. Recently, a shipment from UNICEF arrived from Denmark, and it was filled with donations from the United States of America, and they thanked Russia and China for the donation. Okay, it is what it is. And but I can tell you that, for instance, we're working closely to make sure that there's a mechanism by which President Guaido recently announced a $100 a month bonus payment to frontline healthcare workers. Now, you got to put all this in context. The minimum wage in the country is around $2. It might be $1.50 now. And the
wait.
$2 a month.
Thank you.
$2 a month, not an hour, not a day, a month. And the food basket for a family of four, due to hyperinflation and scarcity, is close to $300 a month for a food basket for four people. And you make $2 a month. And as they say in South Carolina, that dog don't hunt. It doesn't compute. And we are working to get people like the callers, family members, this bonus, which will go through a mechanism for total transparency directly to them into a digital wallet that's being created by the OAS. We're trying as best we can. World Food Program last year did a nationwide study in Venezuela that the Venezuelans are not allowing them to exercise inside the country. They know food food scarcity problems are. And also remember, a year ago in February, Delcy Rodriguez and Nicolas Maduro and the rest of them, Delcy Rodriguez being the vice president, said there was not a humanitarian problem in the country.
Right.
It refused humanitarian assistance that was on the borders in Colombia and in Brazil from entering the country. Now, we got it into Venezuela, and we get stuff into Venezuela every day. The U.S. government is invested over $660 million to help Venezuelans both inside and outside of Venezuela through humanitarian assistance.
Okay, I've got a question here. We've got about 6 minutes left. And I somehow lost the gentleman's name asking the question, the editor of a book called Modern Slavery. The question is, how do you see the situation in Venezuela and those fleeing Venezuela as impacting trafficking in persons and modern slavery, both in Venezuela and outside the country?
Listen, I will tell you that when I was still in Venezuela, they have a food program called the CLAP, AP, and they provide a box of food on an irregular basis to people who have this fatherland card and who are members of Chavez's party, the PSUV. So it's very politicized. And I told the foreign minister, I said, the only difference I see, I said, I see very little difference between giving people a box of food because they can't afford it with the money they make working every month in slavery. To me, they're very much, they equate. My concern on forced labor is one that we need to keep a close eye on. I have a bigger concern on recruitment of young men into illegal armed groups and gangs across the hemisphere. And I think that's something that we have to keep a very close eye on. And I think that there's some anecdotal evidence that indicates that that's certainly taking place.
Okay, and I just found it. The person who asked that question is Jody Henderson. So I want to make sure we know who she is. Alan Dubose, who is the diplomat in residence, maybe here in Atlanta. I'm not. Maybe somewhere else. If Maduro, and you addressed this question before and gave a short answer. Can you go into it a little bit more? Maduro has been indicted in the U.S. What could his exit plan possibly be if he knows we're looking to arrest him, extradite him to the United States, and try him?
Well, listen, I mean, look at the situation here in Colombia, where the FARC was narcotics trafficking organization. We have indictments against the top leadership, and we're not seeking their extradition from Colombia as part of the peace process. And you know, I normally would have to refer you to the Department of Justice, and I think it's illustrative of the strength of our democracy that we have the separation of powers. You know. Does it make negotiating an exit easier when someone's indicted? Well, I think you understand the answer to that question. But again, we've walked this ground before, and in the case of Manuel Noriega, they were offered outs. And in the case of Venezuela, there's no extradition treaty between our two nations. Now, if the Venezuelans decide that he can live on a farm somewhere, or they use a Chilean model, he becomes a diputado, or a deputy, a congressman for life, and has immunity. These are all things that Venezuelans will have to make decisions on. I'm not suggesting those as policy prescriptions. What I am suggesting is that we have laid out what we believe is the proper way forward. The Venezuelans need to sit down and really nug this out in a transparent way among themselves. We completely agree with President Guaido that they need a national emergency government, and but there remains the ability for us to have conversations with Maduro and others on not about their indictments necessarily, but about next steps, and then of course the Department of Justice would have to deal with their indictments.
Okay, we're coming to an end. Let me just ask you one last question, and this is from me. On December 31st, 2020, what's going to be the situation in Venezuela?
Oh, I'm going to be back at the embassy and the flag's going to be flying high. And again, it's not because I'm ridiculously optimistic. I know that this can't stand. You know, the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice. The fact of the matter is that it is every day. I've said this many times publicly. You'd be surprised at who within the regime is reaching out to us, asking how to make things better and how to get this country back on the right track. We don't want to decide for the Venezuelans who leads Venezuela, but we do believe that the Venezuelans ought to have the chance to decide that for themselves. And that's what we're focused on. Free and fair presidential elections, and we're going to support the Venezuelan people in every way we possibly can.
That's great. Thank you. Jimmy, I want to thank you. This has been a terrific 45 minutes. You're a great sport putting up with apparently bad sound on my computer, for which I apologize. You've answered every question fully, and I really do appreciate that. I got to do a little bit of advertising now for the World Affairs Council of Atlanta. So just so everybody knows, tomorrow at 11 a.m. we've got a program with David Rennie, who is the Economist magazine's correspondent in Beijing. And rather than being interviewed by me, he's going to be interviewed by a professional, Robin Kurnow, who's an anchor at CNN International. It's going to be terrific, and we're going to talk about China as the epicenter of this whole COVID-19 and what it means and how China's coming out of it. We got 3 programs next week. On Tuesday with Dr. Mia Bloom from Georgia State University on extremists in COVID-19, how they're going to can take advantage of it, are taking advantage of it in the Middle East and North Africa. On Wednesday, we have retired U.S. Ambassador Thomas Pickering, who's you can see the reaction on Jimmy's face. When you get Pickering, you want to participate in that. It's going to be terrific. He was Undersecretary for Political Affairs, the top career officer at the State Department, ambassador to the United Nations, ambassador to Russia, ambassador to India, ambassador to El Salvador, Nigeria, Jordan, and what he wants to talk about is Iran. So please, y'all register for that. And then on Thursday of next week, we've got Ed Martinez, who is the president of the UPS Foundation, talking about how UPS responded to COVID and what they're doing around the world. If you have suggestions for speakers, please email me, particularly if you've got a contact with them and you can call them up and get them to do this. I would love for you to make suggestions. This conversation was made possible in part by the UPS Foundation and by all of you who are members of the World Affairs. So already a member, favor to ask of you, please renew your membership, even if it's upgrade your membership to a higher level. If you're not a member, please join. Go to our webpage, wacatlanta.org. Jimmy, you can join. It would just be good for you. Put it good on your CV. But whoever y'all are, please donate. Go to our webpage. It pops up first thing when you go there. We're not doing our in-person program, so things are getting a little tough around here. I'm going to thank you again, Jimmy. This is great, fabulous 45 minutes. And everybody who's online, I will see y'all tomorrow with David Rennie, the Economist Bureau Chief in Beijing, China. So I will see you all tomorrow. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jimmy.